Hello there. This is Coach Couvert. I am your AP dual credit U.S. history teacher for this spring of 2021. All right. First off, my virtual students, this might be the first time I'm actually meeting you guys. I'm super excited to be teaching history to you guys. I know it's unusual circumstances. Typically, it does not happen like this. But overall, just real fast, some things about me. All right. I have a bachelor's and also a master's of history from Texas A&M. I've got multiple master's degrees in education, history fields, and I've been teaching for about 7 years now. During that time, I've this is actually my first year at Kingwood Park. I've actually been teaching at Splendora, Texas for the last 7 years. There, I've started the AP Human Geography as well as the AP US History programs. So I'm super excited to be able to teach you guys. So with that being said, I'm not going to waste too much time. I'm usually very direct and to the point, unless if you're in my class, and then I like to tell stories about history and why history is so important to us to this day. So first off, our first lecture of this whole entire semester is all about period six. What period six roughly expands from about the end of Reconstruction all the way up to the beginning of imperialism as well as the Progressive Era. So for the next 5 lectures, it's a 5-part series. Each one is going to talk about period six, 1877 to about 1898, what deals specifically with the Gilded Age. So the first one we're going to talk about is westward expansion. I always like talking about this one first because it's going to be a huge cause for the next 4 lectures I'm going to talk about during this Gilded Age. So let's begin. As you can see, with a couple of my pictures, westward expansion is all about the movement out west. As you guys already figured out with last semester, moving out west is nothing unusual. 1848, we're going to have the gold rush. You're going to have a flock of migration moving out west in hopes of getting rich fast. As you can see, it's a lot by chuck wagons, it's by moving your family, and it's going to take months on end typically to go from one side of America to the other side due to the lack of reliable transportation. So let us get started. And typically, let's think about how do we know, what do we know about the West? So, first off, typically, whenever Americans at this point, 1870s, 1860s, I start this westward expansion around 1865 due to the fact that even though the Gilded Age is only around the 1870s, you can still figure out westward expansion kind of started at the end of the Civil War. So I'm including those 12 years, 1865 to 1877, into this lecture talking about the Gilded Age westward expansion. Well, at this point, it's the wild frontier. People are going crazy about this. And if you ask a lot of Americans, there's this huge romanticism about it. Whenever Americans ask, what do you think about the West? You're going to have a vivid imagination, hope, prosperity, a second chance. And this is kind of a huge idea of the American dream. So whenever we move out west, it's a romanticism. And to this day, if you think about it, there is still a huge romanticism about that frontier, about that westward expansion. And you see it in Hollywood movies and films to this day, kind of like a recent series called Deadwood. All right, John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, there was all this romanticism. The thing is, with this romanticism, we were not the first ones out west. Dating back thousands, according to geographers, anthropologists, you can actually trace, and we're still not exactly sure, but you could trace the lineage of the individuals who lived there before us back thousands of years ago. Those are the Native Americans. Now, at this point in American history, the Native Americans of the West have been the Native Americans who have been pushed from one area to another due to presidential policies as well as Indian policies that can date back all the way to when the British as well as the Spanish empires controlled America. Now, Native Americans have had a tough time with Americans in general. Depending on which historian research you look at, we can actually trace that there might have been up to 20 million Native Americans before Christopher Columbus came over in 1492. There might have been up to 200 million Native Americans. But what we know is once Native Americans got in contact with European settlers, you're going to have a rapid deduction in the numbers of Native Americans due to cholera, due to typhoid, smallpox, measles, even the chickenpox. These diseases that have been rampant in Europe due to just the hygienic ways is going to take root in America and cause over 90% of the Native American population to dwindle within 10 to 100 years of initial contact. So these Native Americans have been fighting against diseases as well as the British and for a while Americans. Right after the American Revolution, Indian policy. Negotiate with them. Problem was, Britain also negotiated with the Native Americans. And for the most part, individuals like Cherokee and the Iroquois were on the side of the British against us. Well, comes along democracy, and you're going to get someone named Andrew Jackson as president of the United States. Andrew Jackson's policy was pretty much push Native Americans to a certain point. Push them out west. The idea was get them west. We won't have to pay attention to them. We're going to be fine. Problem was, by the time of the 1850s, whenever tensions between the North and South were really growing between free and slave state, what you're going to have is Americans are running back into these Native Americans that we had pushed back not 20 some odd years before that. So what we start getting in the 1850s is a reservation policy. As you can see with the picture up in the top left, this is what's called the Fort Laramie Treaty. Fort Laramie Treaty established a reservation system in these United States of America, where now certain tribes actually had certain lands. Problem was, as we're going to see, Native Americans have a huge distrust of treaties, and it's for a very good reason, but I'll get to that later on. Real fast, why is this a romanticism? Why are Americans so stir crazy about going out west? And there are three reasons why. One, agrarianism. Agrarianism is a political philosophy that relates to the ownership and use of land for farming and agriculture. What we had in America was land, was wealth. You look at the South for a long time, land is wealth. Up in the North, same idea, not so much agricultural based, more industry based as time moves on. So out west, there's an abundance amount of land. There's all this land that's being uncultivated, according to a lot of Americans. Therefore, you're going to have a huge push that land can be established for the good of America. The second reason is what's called the frontier thesis. And this is the bottom right picture. This is Frederick Jackson Turner. And Frederick Jackson Turner wrote a book in 1893, and it has a frontier thesis. This thesis, states that the American character, including democracy and materialism, derived from the frontier experience. What he was getting at was the frontier made America the character that we are. Without being pushed out west, America would not be defined as what America is right now. We would not be the United States of America like we know it if we did not move to the frontier. The third reason why, in this bottom left, as you guys might have seen with previous semester, manifest destiny. The idea that it's our destiny to settle east to west, to colonize new parts of North America, that is our God-given right. Now, throughout this time, all right, for all three of these reasons, you're going to have huge migration of individuals. So now let's get into the next part, all right? And this is all about the individuals who moved out west. Well, first off, the West is full of hope, second chances, new opportunities. The idea that as Americans, we could get rich fast. And that's going to be a huge theme with a lot of America, that the idea that we could get rich very, very fast. Problem was this romanticism, this full of hope. Americans knew what was out west. We heard stories. You had individuals go all the way to San Francisco and come back, and they told about barren wastelands. They talked about the Great American Desert. They talked about these mountains where it got snowy and cold all the time. They talked about these Native Americans who were hostile. To a lot of Americans, moving out west did not sound too hot. Yeah, it was romanticism. But just think, you've had a lot of great ideas. Have you ever gone through all those ideas? Probably not. Same idea here. We had all this great idea. Oh my gosh, the romanticism. Let's move out west. No, maybe not. I don't know if I could grow up my stuff right there. So for this reason, not a lot of individuals were moving out west in the early 1860s. So what the government did is they actually created what's called the Homestead Act of 1862. And the Homestead Act of 1862 would do the following. It would give families pieces of land of 160 acres for free. Now, I say free because the initial price was free, but every single year after that first year, they had to pay a $30 fee. So, free $30. All right. The only other things that you had to do with this land, government said you had to live on it for 5 years and improve it. All improvement meant build a house, maybe build a fence. The land's been improved. It's that agrarianism idea. All right, we've cultivated that land. Now, this Homestead Act will convince over 500,000 families to take up their lives from the simple East or chaotic East and move out West. 500,000. Now, for the most part, that's a lot of people because you're thinking at this point, 1860, well, family sizes are between 6 to 8. 2 parents, 4 to 6 kids. Because the thing is, the more hands you have, the more help you have on a farm. That's going to be huge for a lot of these homesteaders. Also, on top of that, there's no guarantee that your child is going to live past the age of 1 and 2. America at this point, medical care is not real high. During the Civil War, there's a reason why over 600,000 individuals died. You're using the same bloody tools one after another. Now, a huge aspect of these homesteaders that moved out west, we also are going to see the first mass migration of African Americans from the South into a new area. As you see, we have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. But now the government after 1865 is showing them all this land out west. Well, you've been oppressed in the South for so many years since you were born, and the West is full of hope. It's that romanticism about another life, a brand new life. It's all yours if you want it. So what you're going to have is these African American families are going to fall under what's called the exodusters. Pretty much they take the biblical term of the Exodus in the Old Testament and they apply it to this, where you're going to have a mass exodus of African American families from the South into the West. Now, whenever all these individuals get out west, they get past what's called the 100th meridian, as you can see up in the top picture. That 100th meridian is pretty much the dividing point. And what you have is on the right side, the east side of this map, you have a different sort of climate. You have the ability and you get a lot of rain, you get a lot of moisture. What a lot of these homesteaders are going to figure out is left or west of that line, you're going to get dry farming. You're going to get the Great Plains in the Midwest. You're going to get the Sierra Nevada mountains. You're going to get Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada's deserts. You're not going to get what you had in the Northeast or the South, for that matter. It doesn't exist anymore. So for all these individuals who, all this newspapers, as you can see on the right side, all this government funding, endorsement of moving out west, as you can see with the stamps, the reality is they had dry farming, and most homesteaders are going to realize what they brought to the west, the crops that they had, cotton, tobacco, indigo, rice, are going to fail. And for a while, individuals are going to be left with nothing. Now remember, government stated you had to live there for 5 years. So at the end of those 5 years, what you're going to have is thousands of families moving back. Just to give you one example, half the population of Kansas in 1870, half of it will be gone in 1890 because they weren't used to dry farming. Now that's just one group of people who moved out west. The second group is the idea that how can we get rich fast? Find gold and silver. And with that being said, you're going to have the mining frontier. Starts in 1848, California Gold Rush comes around. And the California Gold Rush is going to set a precedence for the future. And what I mean by that is pretty much you're going to see the same process exist time after time after time again, all the way up to one of the last gold rushes that in Alaska called the Klondike Gold Rush. Now, in 1848, you had prospectors come out. These prospectors are just looking around, seeing if there's any gold or silver lying around. Boom, they find some. Next thing you know, they bring in equipment. So you're talking about other individuals who use this equipment, heavy machinery. This machinery gets involved, someone has to operate it. So you have an influx of migrants from all over America, as well as immigrants across the world, moving here to work these machines. Well, if there's machines, there's people, guess what's going to pop out? And this is where you're going to get the existence of what's called boom towns. Now, boom towns come and go. As you can see in the middle here, some boom towns can be tent cities. A lot of boom towns, after a while, if they're well established, what I mean by well established, like you actually find gold and silver for more than 6 months, you're actually going to get a town that's actually going to be established. And so a good example of this is at the Comstock Lode in Nevada. There, you're going to have what's called Virginia City. Virginia City is going to be the home of people like Mark Twain later on. But Virginia City and the Comstock Lode was a huge gold and silver mine. At its maximum, at the end of its existence, the Comstock Lode is going to give over $320 million worth of gold and silver to the American government. Now, again, these boom towns, they come because they're going to get rich. All right. If you've ever watched a movie or show, it is rated R, but it is a good show. All right. It's called Deadwood. Same idea. It's a boom town. Now, with boom towns, they come and go. They'll be there one day, gone the next day. Turns into a ghost town. Because here's the thing. All those individuals who are living there are typically trying to find gold and silver. But that gold and silver runs dry, they're moving on. It's not like they're going to stay and, well, we're stuck here. No, they're going to take whatever possessions they have and keep moving west. So for that reason, boom towns come and go. But some are going to stick around. San Francisco, Sacramento, I forgot the comma there in my PowerPoint, as well as Denver. Those places are going to stick around because they're going to find more value besides just being a gold and silver mine. Now, out of all of this, what you're kind of getting also at the end of it is very few individuals actually are going to get rich fast. Gold and silver is all grand, but it's not like everyone who's on flood to the California gold rush finds gold. There's a reason why, and I'm a football fan. I'm a football coach. You can see me in my hoodie right now. It's all about football. All right. I love football because it's all about history. And there's one specific team that talks about the gold rush, and that's the San Francisco 49ers. All right. Even though they're based off in 49, a year after the California gold rush, they're talking about the gold rush itself. And there's also a reason why their two colors are gold and red. It was actually supposed to be blood red because if you didn't find gold, you might have to fight for it. All right. So very few people are actually going to get rich based off of that. Now, I've established two groups of people who are moving out west. There's a third group, and these are your individuals who are using railroads, railroad companies, or those working on the railroads. Now, let me explain why railroads are moving out west. You're the government of the United States. You want to settle the West. So you create the Homestead Act. You're going to give free land to people. But then you're going to get such events like the Donner Party. Or if you don't know about the Donner Party was a family. They're moving over to California. Winter's about to set in, and all of a sudden they're kind of stuck. Do we stay or do we go? And they believe they found a shortcut to the route they were taking, but it took them up a mountain. Now, up on this mountain, one of their axles broke. The dad tells one of the other individuals to go get help. By the time that individual got help, comes back, it had been weeks of isolation for this Donner family, excuse me. By the time they got back, there's only one individual living, and that was the dad himself. And what they saw is cannibalism. Body parts, bones were all around. Individuals had started eating their dead because the food supplies ran out. All the horses were killed. So what you're seeing is that's bad PR for a government who's trying to tell you, come out west, settle the West. So for that reason, the government needs a new system, a new source of transportation. Water's great. The problem was, especially in the Civil War, whenever you had a Confederate army attacking Mexico, and the government in Washington, D.C. freaked out about how they might invade California, and there was no way to actually transport a Union army from New York to California, except for by boat. And even by boat, it took 3 months. And by the time the Union army got to California, the Confederate army had already been beaten in Shelby, New Mexico. That's 3 months. That's still the same distance as going by wagon. So they're looking around, and of course, they picked the one transportation source that could help influence the settlement of the West. That's the railroads. Now, if you're a railroad company at this point, you're thinking, what's in it for me? If you want me to move out west, I got to build these railroad tracks. I got to pay my employees. I need more employees. I need all these machines, these gears. That's going to cost me millions of dollars at this time. So finally, the government comes up with an incentive again. Just like they gave an incentive to settlers, now they're going to give incentives to the railroad companies. And that incentive comes in the form of free land for every mile of track that they're going to lay down. And what they're getting about 1 square mile on either side of the track for every single mile of track they lay. Now, think about it this way. All right. Government is actually kind of smart if you don't realize that from time to time. Why would a railroad company care about free land on either side of the railroad track? Well, you guys live in certain places of the world where you have Wi-Fi, where hopefully there's a restaurant close by, where hopefully there's a store right next to you, where a school system exists. Hopefully you're not traveling hours to go from one place to another. We all want to be living right next to a major source of transportation. If you live right next to a major source of transportation, you're going to get the latest fashions, the latest trends, the latest media, latest food styles, all this great stuff. So what this railroad company starts doing, and this is what the government wanted, railroad companies are going to start selling that land right next to the railroad to settlers. And you're going to get towns being built right next to all these railroads. So, in lieu, think about it, settlers paying for this land, that payment of land that was free from the government is going to paying the railroad employees, paying for goods, paying for supplies, paying for material, paying for all this. So literally, these railroad companies are building railroad tracks for free, and they're going to benefit it in the long run. You're changing the transportation system. Now, by the time that all these incentives or what we call subsidies end, the government's going to give over 170 million acres of public land to railroad companies. 170 million. That's a lot of land for a lot of railroad companies. Now, one of the big pushes at this time, especially in 1862, is we got to connect the East to the West. I told you about the Union Army, talked to you about the Donner family, but if we want to connect East to West, because we have a giant nation. Some other examples of giant nations are Russia, China, and they have not even connected their whole entire west to east country. Russia will follow suit. They're going to build one of the largest railroads known to mankind, what's going to expand over 9 different time zones. 9. So we were one of the first ones to connect our east to west country of mass by building a transcontinental railroad. And you're going to get 2 companies who are going to be essential in building this. One is still very, very popular in the state of Texas, and that's going to be the Union Pacific. Union Pacific, they're going to start in Omaha, Nebraska. They're going to work out west. You have the other one, Central Pacific, which is going to start in Sacramento and move east. Now, as these companies are moving towards each other, Union Pacific realized they have it a lot easier than the Central Pacific. Because if you know anything about Nebraska, besides that it has a lot of corn, and the university is called the Corn Huskers, you get flat land for miles on end. Over in near Sacramento, you have the Sierra Nevada mountains. So what you get is the Central Pacific struggles to build this railroad. That you're going to use a lot of immigrants to help build it. Specifically, these immigrants are going to be coming in the form of Chinese and Japanese immigrants, mostly Chinese. And these Chinese are going to have the most dangerous job of these railroad employees. They are going to be handling nitroglycerin, aka TNT. And at this point, TNT was so volatile. There's a reason why movies, if you ever watch a movie, they got to hold it still. Even how fast my water's moving in my blender bottle might be a little bit dangerous for me. A little tiny trip, that could cause an explosion with a lot of early TNT. So oftentimes you're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese immigrants being killed due to these explosions. But the Central Pacific blows up the mountains. They are literally blowing up huge sections of these mountains to build these railroads, and it works. Finally, the East meets the West. It takes 7 years, 1862 to 1869. And in May of 1869, these 2 railroad companies are going to meet at what's called Promontory Point for a very prominent reason, Utah. And it's going to be the last stake is going to be gold, symbolizing how the original idea of moving out west started because of the gold rush. Now, along this way, railroads are also going to be huge for one other reason: creating new economic markets. Now, I've mentioned 3 types of people moving out west: homesteaders. You're also going to have individuals who are trying to get rich fast, those miners, as well as railroads and those who work around it. The last group are going to be more your ranchers as well as your cattle-driven individuals. So during the Civil War, the South was being blockaded. They had very few sources of food. One of these sources actually came from Texas. and that was what's called the Texas Longhorn. It's a hybrid piece of cattle that dates its lineage all the way back up to Spain. All right, comes over during the Columbus trade. All right, Christopher Columbus comes over, brings his cattle with him. They hybrid, and soon enough, what you're going to get is this cattle with these long horns, the Texas Longhorns. Now, at its peak in the 1860s, there are going to be over 5 million Texas Longhorns roaming out west. Now, the Confederates found a new source. It's kind of nice to have some red meat. Problem was, it is extremely hard to take 5 million pieces of cattle who are living in this huge open plain in Texas and move them to the east. Chicago, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, all these places. Because if you're taking this cattle along, they're going to create stampedes. They're going to destroy property. So for a long time, even though we knew about all these cattle being in the West, there was no way to get this cattle to the east for food sources. You don't have refrigeration at this time. Even the fastest railroad can't take a butchered piece of cattle and move it all the way to New York in time before it goes rotten. So for a while, the Longhorns sit. They roam the plains of Texas. Finally, though, those railroads moving out west, they open up a new opportunity. Now, there's not that many railroads being built in Texas or Oklahoma because those are considered to be Confederate provinces and states. The closest railroad that you're going to have is in Kansas, Dodge City, Abilene. Well, it's still a very relative long distance. But the thing was, individuals started realizing it's a straight shot, straight north from the plains of Texas to these areas. And they have railroads, and these railroads lead to Chicago. Chicago and the surrounding area at this point is kind of the meat packing and butcher plant of America because it's more of the central location of the 1860s, 1870s. You butcher a piece of cattle in Chicago, it can get anywhere in the United States within 3 to 4 days before it goes rotten. So for that reason, you start getting what's called the cattle drive. Now, at this point in America, we're seeing all these farmers, all right, we're seeing all these miners, we're seeing all these individuals moving out west. You're going to have one other group, and that's cowboys. And these cowboys can trace their lineage all the way back to the Spanish Empire. The mission system of Texas, for example, had to have someone who took care of all the animals. And these individuals, and I'm pretty bad with Spanish, are vaqueros. And these vaqueros had the original idea. Sombreros, boots, horses. That was the original cowboy. And so the cowboys of today, of the 1800s, trace their lineage back to them. Now, here's the best part about the cattle drive. The cattle drive was not discriminatory. For the most part, to be a cowboy, you had to have a horse, you had to have a gun, and you had to have the will to do something to get some money. So what you're going to see is these cowboys, these are former criminals from out east. These are African Americans from the South trying to make a living. These are Hispanics who are, for a while, considered to be second-rate citizens. It's a new opportunity. And so some of these cowboys, they're not the greatest individuals, but guess what? They're going to make money off the cattle drive because for every single piece of cattle that you're going to have that gets delivered to Dodge City, Abilene, Kansas, you're talking about $30 to $50 a head. And if you take about 20 cowboys, a wrangler who's in charge, and thousands of cattle, you're talking about a pretty good paycheck once in the fall, once in the spring. Now, for about 10 to 15 years, this goes unhindered. The cattle drive is great, and we're going to get a lot of great things out of it. If you love chicken fried chicken, you love chicken fried steak, well, guess what? It's all because of the cattle drive. Now, at a certain point, though, these homesteaders who have failed to produce crops or finally figured out what crops to actually produce, like corn or this hard wheat that's actually going to possibly be a cause of the uh, the Dust Bowl, they finally figure out that these cattle are causing issues because as they move up north, they are destroying property. So, to counter that, barbed wire. Now, you're thinking barbed wire doesn't keep me out. Yes, because it's not meant to keep humans out all the time. But if you're talking about a 1 ton piece of cattle and it's moving in a straight line, and then it runs up against barbed wire, hits it in the face, stabs it, that cattle's gonna go crazy, causing a stampede. And they're not gonna run towards the sharp objects. No, they're gonna be running towards the individuals who are leading them. They're gonna try and escape. So what you have is barbed wire starts being used by these homesteaders, these what later on they're called ranchers, and this will soon start being one of the reasons why the cattle drive will end. Droughts are another huge reason, as well as 2 back-to-back horrible blizzards in 2 consecutive years. So soon enough, the cattle drive will die off. But you're going to have all these cowboys and some of these homesteaders turn to ranching instead. Because now what they realize is if I could just keep breeding these cattle, this is my cattle and I could sell it. And soon enough, you're going to have the ranching industry really start taking off because the combination of cowboys as well as homesteaders. Now, we got 4 different groups moving out west, all for good reasons. But the third part of westward expansion is all about the fact that we're going to meet resistance along the way. Now, we talked about it. North America's already settled, Native Americans. Ever since the early times, Britain, the Empire of Britain, British colonies, Native Americans have had a very interesting history with Americans themselves. First moved out west, and then after a while, the reservation system. As you can see with the bottom left, take a look at the Native American land throughout time. 1850, once again, American government policy was just push them west. By 1865, you already have the adoption of the Fort Laramie Treaty. So now you're creating reservation systems. So you're kind of getting this idea right here. But at the end of the Civil War, American government starts focusing on the West again. They start taking away some of this land, as we're going to see. Still have reservations, but you're not going to have as much land anymore, as seen in the bottom left with the 1880 picture. And then after the Dawes Act, the final act that's going to pretty much almost destroy the Native American culture, you're going to have very, very few reservation systems after 1897. Now, again, all these individuals moving out west leads to some sort of conflict. For Native Americans, most of them see this conflict as a last stand. They know treaties are probably going to be violated. It's nothing new, especially in terms of prospectors coming in. Their government and the army will always back up prospectors. And so this is going to lead to your Indian Wars. Now, the first really takeoff of these Indian Wars happened with Captain Fetterman of 1866. Captain Fetterman, on the frontier at this point, right at the end of the Civil War, takes a group of civilians and soldiers, and he's moving them up to a certain fort. Because along the frontier, all the way from the Dakotas, Wyoming's, Montana, all the way down to Texas, you have a string of forts protecting the frontier. So he's taking these individuals to one of these forts. Along the way, a Native American war party attacks them. In the ensuing battle, 81 people, civilians and soldiers, including Captain Fetterman, will be killed. Now, let me just say there's a prejudice that exists in America at this point. And you're going to see that prejudice as well as kind of the early starts of the yellow journalism at this point come out that whenever a Native American tribe won a battle against the army, the headlines are always going to say massacre. But whenever the army wins a battle or kills innocents, Native Americans, battle, victory. And that's swaying public opinion. You hear massacre, you're like, dear gosh, these people are horrible. You hear victory, you're like, I bet you it was a heroic thing. And as we're going to see, not every single victory the Army won was very heroic. So let's move on. Fetterman, 81 individuals. Soon enough, though, you're going to have what's called the War for the Black Hills. Black Hills, top left picture. All right, talking about the Dakotas. Prospectors move around, and in one of the Indian reservations, they find gold. And once again, we know that Native American treaties are often violated. At this point, Native Americans look towards the Army, look towards the federal government for help. And next thing you know, the Army's moving in. So you're going to have a war for the Black Hills. What leads to, amongst other things, the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871. The Indian Appropriation Act of 1871 pretty much just stated this. All past treaties with Native Americans are now null and void. Secondly, now let me look real fast. All Native American tribes are no longer sovereign nations. What meant they are all below the status of being a part of a federal government system. What this means is it's kind of open season for the military to do what they want. And so they're going to send out one of their most fitting generals at this point, in a lot of people's opinion, to go take care of this Native American issue. And that is none other than General George Armstrong Custer. Now, George Armstrong Custer, middle bottom left picture, was a hero in the Civil War. Medal of Honor recipient. All right. A huge reason why Jeb Stuart lost the battle, or lost a part of the Battle of the Gettysburg, and was also at Appomattox Courthouse whenever Lee surrendered. He's considered to be a hero. He was considered to be top notch. He graduated West Point. He's got to be smart. In reality, Custer graduated near the bottom of his class at West Point, won that part of the battles of Gettysburg because he had more troops, was at Appomattox because he was the ranking cavalry officer. Not because he was in charge of all the cavalry, he was a ranking cavalry officer because of his heroic deeds at Gettysburg. On top of that, this man almost was shot because he slept with another man's wife. So, not the smartest individual, but once again, dashing good looks, womanizer. He could talk. So, for that reason, he goes out there. Well, one day, Custer and his 7th Regiment of Cavalry, about a little over 700 soldiers, are there to protect prospectors as well as railroad workers from Native Americans. And the policy was it's open season, kind of. So if you see a Native American tribe and they are not recognized already, surround them, force them to capitulate, and then take them back. Well, as he's getting closer to Little Bighorn, a creek, he stumbles upon a teepee village. Now, at this point, Native American settlements are not going to be big. They're not going to be like the flowing towns and cities that you're going to see out east at this point. No, they're talking about maybe hundreds, possibly no more than 1,000 individuals at this area. Problem was, this was just no ordinary teepee village. This was a combination of tribes and 2 huge Native American leaders. That is Sitting Bull as well as Crazy Horse. Now, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse got together at Little Bighorn to talk about the final push from the federal troops into their territory and kind of make a last stand. They woke up that morning of the Battle of Little Bighorn, seeing cavalry charging at them. Custer had decided to split his force into 3 segments. One force under him with his brother and his brother-in-law would pretty much go straight at the enemy on the right flank. He would send his mate, his second in command, across the river, across Little Bighorn on the left side to kind of trap the Native Americans if they run across the river, kind of a pincer move. And then he had a reserve force that stayed at the camp and just waited for word. Now, at the end of the day, the force on the other side of the river, second in command, as well as the reserve force, come back to camp and wait for Custer. And they knew a battle had ensued from all the yelling, the gun firing, and all this other stuff. Whenever finally the Native American tribe would leave, this segment of the forces would move up to an area where they last saw Custer and his squads. There, in what's known as Custer's Last Stand, they found the bodies of 268 soldiers, stripped of clothing and weapons, some of them scalped, and some of them mutilated. Now, we can't really know exactly the events of Custer's Last Stand. There's no actual accurate stories because, once again, the soldiers, every single soldier in that group died, including Custer's brother, Custer's brother-in-law, all of them, Custer himself. So you're going to have a lot of visual representations, as you see in the bottom right, about Custer's Last Stand, and all of them are false. All of them are not actual true representations. We do not know what occurred at Custer's Last Stand. But think about the propaganda that this can offer to the East. You have 268 bodies mutilated. Now, finally the story comes out, and it's not a real battle, it's a massacre at Little Bighorn, where 268 soldiers are killed. They were attacked by thousands, and they were actually accurate. There was over 2,000 Native American warriors at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And these newspapers have a craze. Well, as an American, you're reading these newspapers, you hear massacre, you hear a massacre of a heroic general during a civil war. That's going to get your blood boiling for the most part, unless, of course, if you fought for the other side. For that reason, you pretty much are going to slowly get the capitulation of Native Americans for about the next 13 years. Now, Little Bighorn occurs in 1877. I might be off by year 1876. Excuse me, I didn't write it down. It's been a while since I've actually looked it up. But what you're going to get for the next 13 years is Native Americans are making their last stand. And they know this. In 1889, a few of the Native American tribes get together. They have a religious ceremony. They call it the Ghost Dance. And it's pretty much their last movement to stop the encroachment of federal troops. Problem is, many Native American troops, one of the biggest, Nez Perce, had already capitulated in 1877, as a lot of them are trying to run up to Canada to flee. Now, the Nez Perce, by the way, were one of the tribes who took parts in a lot of federal and Native American battles. So there's a huge reason why their capitulation was big, because they are one of the bigger tribes in terms of this war. So the Ghost Dance leads to some of the final battles that you're going to have. Sitting Bull, one of the leaders at the Battle of Little Bighorn, he will be surrounded at his house in 1890, arrested, and later killed. Once again, to a lot of Americans, he's the man who massacred Custer and his soldiers. As the wars are dwindling down, to begin with the Indian Wars, you didn't even have more than 250,000 Native Americans around in the start of the 1870s. You had less than 250,000. So the last remaining Native Americans are making their last holdouts. But for most of them, they start realizing here's the end. Now, I told you guys, once again, propaganda, 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 propaganda. One of these propaganda pieces was what's called the Battle of Wounded Knee. At the Battle of Wounded Knee, there's a lot of different sources that say what happened, but pretty much it went along like this. 300 Native Americans had already surrendered to the federal troops. Federal troops were escorting them from one place to another. And then at this one place, Wounded Knee, they started taking up their weapons. Now, according to some federal army sources, they believe that a Native American by the name of Black Coyote took a shot at an army soldier. Thus, you start getting a battle. Problem was, at the end of this battle, that's supposedly the federal troops call a battle, you had 200 Native American women, children, and men all massacred. And a lot of them were shot in the back. And being shot in the back is huge because you're being shot in the back doesn't mean you're running towards your enemy. It means you're running away from your enemy. So once it goes out east, it's a battle. It's heroic. As you can see with certain battles, for example, on the right picture, all right, you can see what a lot of people actually think Wounded Knee was like. You get the middle picture, you don't get that idea. You get actually like it's a battle. All right. But now, all this, the whole entire relationship of the Native Americans has been one of here's a treaty, violated, war, here's a treaty, violated, war. And finally, it gets to the point where we got to enter a new phase of relationship between Native Americans and the government. In 1881, Helen Hunt Jackson will write a book called A Century of Dishonor, where he talks about the ugliness and how the federal government has treated Native Americans for the last century. Now, what does this book do? It does two things. One, it gathers sympathy for the Native Americans. People feel sympathetic to their cause. Oh my gosh. At the same time, in a counter way, those who are sympathetic realize the only way Native Americans, how their sympathy could be repaid is by destroying the Indian culture that has caused all of this. Very unusual. I don't often see sympathy. Oh, I feel bad for you. Yeah, we should destroy that. I don't often see those things going hand in hand. But at this point, that's kind of what it meant. Now, for this reason, the government's going to pass what's called, for this reason, amongst other reasons, the wars, you're going to have the government pass what's called the Dawes Civility Act of 1887. And the Dawes Act is an attempt to assimilate Native Americans into the American culture, or what I call the white culture of the time. And so they're going to establish all these schools along the East Coast as well as the western part of the United States to help train Native Americans under the age of 25 in an American culture way. They pick a white person's name. They learn how to dress like a white person. They learn how to make a bed like a white person. They're going to learn how to speak English, how to praise Christianity, all right? How to be job oriented, how to write in English. So this is an attempt of get rid of your culture. Now you're my culture. And for a lot of government officials, a lot of individuals, they saw that the reason why Native Americans and Americans never worked out eye to eye was because we are just two complete different cultures and we could not get along. Dawes Act eliminates the cultural boundaries and makes one culture where we can all be together. Now, the idea of assimilation for most Americans is the idea that we're making Native Americans civilized. Well, those are all the individuals under the age of 25. Native Americans above the age of 25 are still going to be a part of what's called a reservation system under the Dawes Act. And what they get is they get land from about 160 acres, the same amount of land that homesteaders got in 1862 out west, but they're going to typically get the more poor and desolate lands. On top of that, interesting numbers, the Dawes Act will give 47 million acres of land to Native Americans, but in return, it will take 90 million acres of land. 90 million acres of land mean more money for the government while giving 47 million of the more poorer regions to Native Americans. Now, the Dawes Act nearly did what it was supposed to do. It nearly destroyed the Indian culture. But Native Americans in America will find a lot of use within the next 50 years. During World War I, for example, you might have seen Wonder Woman. You also know that Wonder Woman, one of the soldiers that they fight with, is actually a Native American. While Wonder Woman is not based on true events, hopefully you guys understand that, the idea of Native Americans serving in the military in World War I is absolutely true. And they served with distinction and honor through the year that we fought this war. Oftentimes, their job was to sneak into no man's land, go across the border, and in the morning time, whenever a German soldier woke up, they would typically find their friends' throats sliced, their friends mutilated, causing fear and havoc amongst the Germans that these Americans are blood hungry. They're bloodthirsty savages who want to kill Germans. And it would cause a fear, and that was a huge reason why in the Battle of Argonne Forest, German forces would melt away so fast against Americans. For this reason, and all this dishonor that's been brought upon their culture, in 1924, you're going to have President Calvin Coolidge sign the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, what states Native Americans are now citizens of the United States. Their lands cannot be taken up anymore. From there on, you're going to have you have been having the slow growth of Native Americans coming back to more of their predominance that they saw back in the day. They went from 200,000 in 1924. Now that you could trace over 2 million individuals to Native American heritage. Now, this is not the only resistance, though, we're going to face out west. You've already had a lot of resistance from Native Americans, but there's one group that already lived in Southwest America before American settlers came, and that's your Hispanics. And at this point, during the Mexican-American War, Hispanics living in California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas are all given this idea that if they join with the Americans, they're going to become landowners, they're going to have property rights, they're going to have citizenship, all of this. Problem was, after the war's over, all of that, all those rights that they were told that they were going to get were dragged through the mud, through legislation, time after time after time again. So finally, by the 1890s, these individuals who were given all these rights, or were supposed to be given these rights, find themselves working some of the hardest jobs, some of the more menial blue-collar jobs at this time, that of beet farmers, miners, railroad workers, alongside with other immigrants who have been moving into the country that they've been there for many, many years. So finally, what you're going to get is a rising up of the poor Hispanic community, again, excuse my Spanish, known as Las Gordas Blancas, the Whitecaps. And the Whitecaps are going to burn down buildings. They're going to take to the streets. But like anything else, the federal government is going to come in with the army and shut down this rebellion. Now, a lot of Las Gordas Blancas realize that by taking to the torch, you're not going to have a lot of you're not going to be able to win a lot of issues. So a lot of them actually become politicians and are going to gain political office and are going to fight for their rights.